The government knows AGI is coming. That is the warning that serves as the title of a new episode of the Ezra Klein Show, which is a podcast in which the journalist interviews Ben Buchanan, who is the former special advisor for AI to the Biden White House. And in this episode, both Klein and Buchanan agree that AGI, or systems that can do any type of cognitive task that a human can do, is likely to arrive in the next few years. Klein starts this episode by saying, "For the last couple of months, I've had this strange experience. Person after person from artificial intelligence labs, from government, has been coming to me saying it's really about to happen. We're about to get artificial general intelligence. What they mean is that they have believed for a long time that we are on a path to creating transformational artificial intelligence capable of doing basically anything a human being could do behind a computer, but better," says Klein. "They thought it would take somewhere from 5 to 15 years to develop, but now they believe it's coming in 2 to 3 years during Donald Trump's second term." In this episode, Klein and Buchanan cover a lot of ground related to what this all means. They talk about AI competition between the US and China, how the Trump administration will approach AI, and what AGI could mean for jobs, national security, and cybersecurity. Now, this probably may be one of the more important interviews you listen to this month, or maybe even this year if things play out. Buchanan clearly knows his stuff, shares a lot of great perspective from his time working on AI in the White House, but also this podcast leaves a lot of things unanswered. Klein strongly argues that we're not remotely prepared as a society for what's coming in the next few years, especially when it comes to AI's impact on the economy. So, Paul, I'll turn it over to you here. Why don't you walk us through what you found most worth paying attention to in this very extensive and kind of unnerving interview?
Yeah, it's definitely worth listening to, and we'll link to the opinion piece in the New York Times that has the full transcript as well. So if you prefer to read it, it's a good way to go through it. Um, yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of noteworthy things to touch on here. So first, if people aren't familiar with Ezra Klein, he has been writing New York Times opinion pieces since 2021. He was the founder and editor in chief, and then editor at large of Vox. Has the Ezra Klein Show, obviously, which is number 9 in terms of Apple Podcast top shows charts. So he's a top 10 podcast in the world on Apple Podcasts. I assume similar in Spotify. So he's someone that a lot of people listen to, and it was a very aggressive interview. I think Buchanan, who I wasn't familiar with honestly before this, I'm sure we saw his name. I don't know that we've ever talked about him on the show, but
Yeah.
he was obviously involved in the Biden White House pretty significantly. So I did look into him a little bit because I was curious, like, who this guy was that played such a key role. And his background is very, very heavy national security and cybersecurity. So he's the former director of Cyber AI Project at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. He's currently an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's director for technology and national security for the National Security Council for 1 year during the Biden White House. He did his postdoc at Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center, where he was working on cybersecurity project. So he's heavy, and this is important context to the conversation to know his background is actually in cybersecurity, and that the Biden White House had someone with a cybersecurity background sort of leading the charge tells you where they think the conversation needs to be at when it comes to this stuff. So I want to start with in the opening of the opinion piece, and I think he said something similar on the podcast. Klein says, if you've been telling yourself this isn't coming, I really think you need to question that. It's not Web3. It's not vaporware. A lot of what we're talking about is already here right now. I think we are on the cusp of an era in human history that is unlike any of the eras we have experienced before. And we're not prepared in part because it's not clear what it would mean to prepare. I think that's a very important point. We don't know what this will look like, what it will feel like. We don't know how labor markets will respond. We don't know which country is going to get there first. We don't know what it will mean for war. We don't know what it will mean for peace. And while there is so much else going on in the world to cover, I do think there's a good chance that when we look back on this era in human history, AI will have been the thing that matters. we're at this moment of a big transition in policymakers, and they are probably going to be in power when artificial general intelligence or something like it hits the world. So what are they going to do? What kinds of decisions are going to need to be made? And what kinds of thinking do we need to start doing now to be prepared for something that virtually everybody who works in this area is trying to tell us as loudly as possible is coming? So that to me is just kind of like encapsulates what we've been saying on the show, Mike. Like
Mm.
this isn't just us. It's not like a couple of talking heads on a podcast who've been following AI for a while who think it's important. This is fundamentally like across organizations, across government, across society. The people in the know are trying very, very hard to get everyone else to pay attention. But as Klein illuminates right away, nobody has a plan for this. And this is what I keep preaching is like, let's just be proactive. So, Mike, you had touched on this definition, but I think it's important that Buchanan talks about a canonical definition. He stressed right away. It was kind of funny. Klein called him out on this. He's like, "I don't like AGI as a term," and he's like, "We get it, man. Stop telling it with every time you use the term." Um, so, a system capable of doing almost any cognitive task a human can do. Now, this is Buchanan. I don't know that we'll quite see that in the next 4 years or so, but I do think we'll see something like that, where the breadth of the system is remarkable, but also its depth, its capacity to, in some cases, exceed human capabilities regardless of the cognitive discipline. Klein then says systems that can replace human beings in cognitively demanding jobs, and Buchanan says yes, or key parts of cognitive jobs. So then when we get into the AI in government, now this is I actually like paused it. I was listening to this in my car, and I paused it after hearing this part, and I'll explain why in a second. So Buchanan says, what's fascinating to me is that this is the first revolutionary technology that is not funded by the Department of Defense, basically. If you go back historically over the last 100 years or so, nukes, space, the early days of the internet, the early days of the microprocessor, the early days of large scale aviation, radar, global positioning system, the list is very, very long. All of that tech fundamentally comes from Department of Defense money. It's the private sector inventing it, to be sure, meaning AI. But the central government role gave the Department of Defense and the US government an understanding of the technology that by default, it does not have an AI. It also gave the US government a capacity to shape where that technology goes. By default, we don't have. What he's saying is most of the innovation, especially the last 50 years, came out of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Department of Defense, meaning they either invented it or they were funding the private development of these technologies. So they were on the inside as it was emerging and they could better plan ahead. The US government has been funding AI for the last 10, 20 years through DARPA, but they got caught off guard by generative AI and all that basically happened over the last 3 years. They were not prepared. They're not the ones that built it. The top language model didn't come out of DARPA. It came out of OpenAI, which the government had no involvement with. It originated out of Google's labs, which the government didn't have access to. So that's a really important point that they've basically been playing catch up, trying to understand this technology. And it appears one of the most important people in that process is a cybersecurity guy. So it tells you again, like the importance. So then they get into AI in China, which they spent a good portion of the conversation on. And I think the real key here is as soon as Klein brought up China, Buchanan directed it to cybersecurity.
Mm.
So this is why his cybersecurity background is so important. So it helps illuminate how the government thinks about AI. First and foremost, this is national security and military dominance. So jobs in the economy are secondary. It's not that the government isn't aware it might have this massive impact. They're just far more concerned about military dominance and national security, which is what DARPA's existence is all about, is military dominance and protection of democracy in the US. So in the AI and China debate, Buchanan says it's pretty out in the open that if you had a much more powerful AI capability, that would probably enable you to do better cyber operations on offense and on defense. What is cyber operation, he asks? Breaking into an adversary's network to collect information, which, if you're already collecting in a large enough volume, AI systems can help you analyze. We actually did a whole big thing through DARPA, which I mentioned, called the AI Cyber Challenge to test out AI's capabilities to do this. And I would not want to live in a world in which China has that capability on offense, defense, and cyber, and the United States does not, meaning he's seen what they're capable of doing with the current AI,
Mm.
and they can project out what they'll be able to do with more powerful AI, and they know they don't want China getting there first. Um, they did touch on cybersecurity in these AI labs, which Mike, you and I have talked about on these shows before. I remember specifically an instance where Dario Amodei was talking about, basically we spend probably billions on trying to protect our models and our weights. Like within Anthropic, only a few people even know the weights to the system. But he said, like, if a foreign government wants it, they're going to get it. Like these people are really good at this, and no matter how strong our protections are, they're going to get it if they want it. And so this whole idea that these foreign actors are trying to hack in through cybersecurity or through cyber, but also at San Francisco parties where all these AI
Right.
researchers sort of openly talk about what they're doing and what they're working on. So this was another instance where I paused and I was like, oh my God, like nationalization of these labs actually seems like something that the Biden administration very likely considered, and that the current administration, I don't think would be as likely to consider. But you start to understand why nationalization of the labs might actually be a strategy that's explored. Because if they become convinced that they need to get there first, and these models are going to become more and more powerful, then the government wants full control of protecting those models. So that was really interesting. And then the one where my ears really perked up was
Right.
when Klein asked him about Mark Andreessen, and I don't remember episode, Mike, what episode it was.
Yeah.
It was like January or something. We talked about
I
that,
think it was
maybe.
right around the beginning of the year. I can look it
Okay,
up. Yeah.
so we'll put the link in the show notes. But if you don't recall, Mark Andreessen, who A16Z, Andreessen Horowitz, the VC firm, he had this very interesting quote where he claimed that he was in a meeting with someone from the Biden administration, I assume in 2024, where they basically told them, don't worry about investing in startups doing AI. There's only going to be 2 or 3 labs, that the Biden administration in the second term is going to make sure that all of this is centered on 2 to 3 companies. Again, they didn't say nationalization, but basically that they could then better control and protect these models. And at the time, we thought that's really weird, and I would be shocked if they said it, but that was the argument Andreessen gave as to why they threw their support behind Trump and why they then pushed very heavily for Trump to get elected. Um, so I've been anxiously awaiting the other side of this story, and this is the first time I've heard anyone who might have been in the room. So Klein says, "Were you part of the conversation that Andreessen was describing?" Ben said, "I met him once. I don't know exactly." He then said, Andreessen talked about concerns related to startups and competitiveness. And I think my view on this is look at our record on competitiveness, and it's pretty clear that we wanted a dynamic ecosystem. Now, I do think there are structural dynamics related to scaling laws and the like that will force things toward big companies that I think in many respects we were pushing against. But I think our track record on competition is pretty clear. That is a very clear non-answer on this
Yeah.
topic, in my opinion. Did you read it the same way, Mike? I was like, well, that didn't answer the
Oh
question.
yeah, I was so excited for the next I was reading the transcript like this morning again. And I was so excited for the next paragraph, and I was like, like a few words in, I was like, "You're not going to answer
Nothing.
this, are
Yeah.
you?" Yeah.
No, and so he basically was like, I might have been in the room to the conversation he's referring to, but maybe that's not exactly what was said. So then Klein says, the view that I understand Andreessen arguing with, which is a view I have heard from people in the AI safety community, but is not a view I had necessarily heard from the Biden administration, was that you will need to regulate the frontier models of the biggest labs when it gets sufficiently powerful. And in order to do that, you will need controls on those models. You just can't have the model and everything floating around so everybody can run this on their home laptop. So, yeah, we didn't get the answer I was hoping for. I don't know who else might have been in that room. I kind of got the impression it probably came from a meeting with Buchanan,
Yeah.
but he just didn't want to like get into the specifics there. um, it was a very politician-like answer for a non-politician.
It really
Uh,
was.
So then the thing, Mike, that jumped out to me, and we'll timestamp this as kind of like the second major topic, was when Klein and Buchanan talked about the impact of AI on jobs. So Klein says one of the other things that Vance, so this is going back to JD Vance's AI Paris Summit talk or manifesto from a few weeks ago that we covered on the podcast, and we'll drop that link in the show notes as well. Um, One of the other things, this is Klein again, one of the other things that Vance talked about and that you said you agreed with is making AI, quote, pro worker. What does that mean? So Buchanan then said, I think we want to have AI deployed across our economy in a way that increases workers, agencies, and capabilities. And I think we should be honest that there's going to be a lot of transition in the economy as a result of AI. Transition is doing a lot of work in that, in that sentence.
No
Um,
kidding.
he continues, I don't know what that will look like. You can find Nobel Prize winning economists who will say it won't be much. You can find other folks who will say it will be a ton. I tend to lead toward the side that says it's going to be a lot, but I'm not a labor economist. The line that Vice President Vance used is the exact same phrase that President Biden used, which is give workers a seat at the table in that transition, which I just laughed, honestly, when I heard that line. That means literally nothing. Like, it's like one of the most useless lines. So Klein then says, and this is where it got kind of chippy, I would say. Like, Klein was going hard here. And that was the note I made to myself. I was like, wow, 51 minutes. He goes really hard on the end chops thing.
Right.
So Klein says, I will promise you, and this is what I have been saying, I will promise you the labor economists do not know what to do about AI. You were the top advisor for AI. You were at the nerve center of the government's information about what is coming. If this is half as big as you seem to think it is, it's going to be the single most disruptive thing to hit labor markets ever, given how compressed the time period is in which it will arrive. It took this again, Klein continues. It took a long time to lay down electricity. It took a long time to build railroads. AI is going to come really quickly. It's going to be harder for the big firms to integrate it. But what you're going to have is new entrants who are built from the ground up, where their organization is built around one person overseeing these like 7 systems. This is the part I was like, whoa. He said, so you might just begin to see triple the unemployment among marketing graduates.
Mhm.
As people who run Marketing I Institute, that one again sort of caught my attention. He then says there are just a lot of jobs that are doing work behind a computer, and as companies absorb machines that can do work behind a computer for you, that will change everything. And he says to Buchanan, you must have heard somebody talking about this. You guys must have talked about this. Buchanan again kind of sidesteps this, and this became his answer basically for everything. We did talk to economists, and to try to texture this debate in 2024, the trend line is even clearer now than it was then. We knew this was not going to be a 2023, 2024 question. Frankly, to do anything robust about this was going to require Congress, and that just was not in the cards at all. So it was more of an intellectual exercise than it was a policy.
Mm.
Now, I found this fascinating, Mike, because all of 2024 during election season, I kept saying, you don't hear anything about AI. Neither
Right,
side
right.
was talking about AI. And then as soon as the administration flips, it just dominates the conversation. And my belief at the time was because you couldn't win votes talking about it. Like there was no point in talking about it because one, they didn't have answers about what it meant. Two, the public didn't seem to care enough to take a
Mm.
side in this debate. And so what we have here is the Biden administration basically saying, we know this is going to decimate the economy and jobs, or might be great for the economy and GDP, but like jobs, it's probably going to decimate in the near term. But it's not going to be on our watch if we win this election, and we're going to need Congress, and like we just can't do anything about this.
Mm.
So we explored it a little bit, and then I'll kind of like wrap up here, Mike, with Klein gave his example of using deep research, which we've talked about as one of those moments for us where you're like, whoa, like this changes things for the future of work. So Klein says, I recently used Deep Research, which is a new OpenAI product. It's on their pricing tier. Most people, I think, have not used it. He's correct. But it can build out something that's more like a scientific analytical brief in a matter of minutes. Klein continues, I work with producers on the show. I hire incredibly talented people to do very demanding research work. I asked Deep Research to do this report on the tensions between Mandelsonian constitutional system and the highly polarized nationalized parties we now have. I don't even know what that means. I need Deep Research to explain to me what that sentence means. And what it produced in a matter of minutes was at least the median of what any of the teams I've worked with on this could produce within days. I've talked to a number of people at firms that do high amounts of coding, and they tell me that by the end of this year or next year, they expect most code will not be written by human beings. And then Mike, like this is a lot, but Klein wasn't the only one talking about AI and jobs this week. So why don't you kind of talk us through a couple of other things? Because again, what I said in the newsletter, what I let out with this is when you zoom out, you just see the trends emerging.
Yep.
And like this on its own was noteworthy. When in the context of the other stuff Mike's about to walk through, all happening in a 5-day period, you start to realize something different is happening. And again, either they're all wrong or we need to be doing more as a business world and as a society to be prepared.
I'm going to dive into that in 1 second. I want to add one final note here that just made me laugh out loud in disbelief is that, you said Klein was really pushing him on stuff. And he was like,
Yeah.
hey, why didn't you game this out? Why didn't you think more about this? Did you have conversations? And he even says at one point, did you drop this into like Claude and game out what could happen? And he literally says no, because the government, like basically alluding to the government had restrictions on using the technology. And Klein says, well, that's a bit damning in and of itself, isn't it? And then they kind of move on. So I was like, we are starting from a place that is way further behind than where I would have anticipated.
Yeah, and that's like again, it's a theme of this show all the time. Is I keep trying to stress to people, if you think someone else is out there doing this research, they're not. Like this came up in the situational awareness episode, Mike. We did
Hmm.
those 2 episodes back to back on Leopold Aschenbrenner's situational awareness. And that's what he said. He's like, dude, if you think someone else is figuring this out, there's like 200 of us in Silicon Valley who are
Mm.
even aware of what's happening. So that's it. Like, there is not some army coming that's going to like figure this all out for everybody.